A history of U.S. presidential elections in maps. The President of the United States is elected every 4 years by way of the Electoral College, a system devised by the creators of the Constitution that today requires a candidate to secure at least 270 electoral votes from the states to win. That means the history of presidential elections is one best told through maps. Click on an election year in our Presidential Election Interactive or on one of the headlines below to see a map of how electoral and popular votes broke down across the states, and to learn more about the elections and their candidates. Election of 1789. On February 4th, 1789, George Washington was unanimously chosen to be the first president of the United States. Election of 1792. In December 1792, electors from 15 states voted George Washington to his second term as president. Election of 1796, John Adams narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson in 1796. Election of 1800, incumbent John Adams once again ran against Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Electoral voters tied, which meant that the House of Representatives would decide the election. It chose Jefferson. Election of 1804. In 1804, Thomas Jefferson, the incumbent, won decisively over Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Election of 1808. After Thomas Jefferson chose not to run for a third term, his fellow Democratic Republican James Madison defeated Charles Cotesworth Pinckney in 1808. Election of 1812. In the midst of war, James Madison was re-elected in 1812, defeating DeWitt Clinton. Election of 1816, James Monroe was elected by a wide margin over Rufus King in 1816. Election of 1820. James Monroe had no opponents in 1820. He was thus elected to a second term. Election of 1824. Although Andrew Jackson received the most electoral votes in 1824, John Quincy Adams was chosen president by the House of Representatives. Election of 1828. In 1828, Andrew Jackson defeated the incumbent John Quincy Adams. Election of 1832, Andrew Jackson easily won re-election over Henry Clay in 1832. Election of 1836. In 1836, Martin Van Buren defeated several Whig candidates. Election of 1840. In 1840, William Henry Harrison prevented Martin Van Buren from winning a second term. Election of 1844, James K. Polk defeated Henry Clay in 1844. Election of 1848. As the United States continued to expand westward, Zachary Taylor defeated Lewis Cass in 1848. Election of 1852. In 1852, Franklin Pierce defeated Winfield Scott, the last Whig Party nominee to run for president. Election of 1856. In 1856, James Buchanan defeated John C. Fremont, and by a much wider margin, former President Millard Fillmore. Election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln defeated 3 other candidates in 1860. 7 southern states seceded between his election and his inauguration in January 1861. Election of 1864. Abraham Lincoln won re-election over George B. McClellan in 1864 as the Civil War continued. Only the states that had remained in the Union voted. Election of 1868. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant defeated Horatio Seymour. Election of 1872. In 1872, Ulysses S. Grant won re-election. He defeated Horace Greeley. Election of 1876. In one of the most disputed presidential elections in American history, Rutherford B. Hayes won by 1 electoral vote in 1876. Samuel J. Tilden lost. Election of 1880. In 1880, James A. Garfield defeated Winfield Scott Hancock. Election of 1884. In 1884, Grover Cleveland defeated James G. Blaine. Election of 1888. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison defeated the incumbent Grover Cleveland. Election of 1892. In 1892, Grover Cleveland defeated the incumbent Benjamin Harrison, thereby becoming the first president to serve discontinuous terms. Election of 1896. William McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan in 1896. It would be the first of Bryan's 3 losses in presidential elections. Election of 1900. In 1900, the incumbent William McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan. Election of 1904. Theodore Roosevelt, who had become president in 1901 after William McKinley's death, defeated Alton B. Parker in 1904. Election of 1908. In 1908, William Howard Taft defeated William Jennings Bryan. Election of 1912. Woodrow Wilson defeated 2 major candidates in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, the incumbent. Election of 1916. Woodrow Wilson won re-election by defeating Charles Evans Hughes in 1916. Election of 1920. In 1920, Warren G. Harding defeated James M. Cox. Election of 1924. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge defeated John W. Davis and Robert M. La Follette. Election of 1928. Herbert Hoover defeated Al Smith by a substantial margin in 1928. Election of 1932. In 1932, during the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover, the incumbent. Election of 1936. In 1936, Franklin D. Roosevelt was re-elected by a large margin, defeating Alf Landon. Election of 1940. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940, defeating Wendell Willkie.